All black, everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back. Black.
Welcome to Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal, and we are thrilled today to be joined by Professor Tricia Rose, the Chancellor's Professor of Africana Studies and Associate Dean of the Faculty for Special Initiatives at Brown University. Professor Rose, of course, is a legendary author and scholar, the author of Longing to Tell, Black Women Talk About Sexuality and Intimacy, which was published in 2003. Hip Hop Wars, What We Talk About When We Talk About Hip Hop and Why It Matters, Basic Books, 2008. The legendary and the classic and iconic Black Noise, Rap Music and Black Culture in Contemporary America, published by Wesleyan in 1994, and we surely will talk a little bit about that today. But she joins us today to talk about her latest book, Metaracism, How Systematic Racism Devastates Black Lives and How We Break Free, published by Basic Press in 2004. Of Metaracism, our friend Robin D.G. Kelly writes, Tricia Rose has long set the bar for what it means to be a leading public intellectual. Brilliant, astute, and fearless, she has taken on the difficult task of demystifying systematic racism from a catchphrase that merely asserts racial disparities are the result of hidden forces, explaining exactly how systematic racism works in the United States. With great clarity and precision, she moves beyond the shocking story, the point of trauma, and the dizzying statistics to expose the system as a whole, apprehending its operations by revealing each part, policy, and practice in the myriad ways they co-join. In the face of relentless attacks on the mere mention of racism and the nonsense spewing from the new anti-racism industry, Metaracism offers the clear-eyed analysis that we urgently need. How are you doing, Tricia?
Oh, it's so good to see you, Mark. It's been forever in person.
Yes, it has. Yes, it has.
I'm glad to be here. Left of Black is like it's like an amazing institution. I remember when you started it, I mean, I thought, well, who has the patience to do this forever? And here you are holding it down. The range of people you've had on this show and all of it captures like the thought of Black studies for the past, 15, 20 years now?
15 years, yes.
15.
I mean, 15.
That's incredibly important, Mark. I mean, I don't know how many people tell you that, but I want to make sure that my time with you is in part really thanking you for that, because as you know, all this media doesn't mean we get heard. All this technology doesn't mean we know what we've been thinking. And we need that kind of space, but that takes commitment. So I really want to thank you for that. It's an incredible resource.
Reading the beginning parts of this book, growing up in Harlem, going to Dalton, making that trip every day from Co-op City. You talk about how those subway rides, watching how people move in and out the subway trains, from the Bronx to 86th Street, was really your first laboratory for understanding race. And it feels, and I don't want to say this book feels like a capstone, because I'm sure you're going to share so much more work with us going forward. But it does feel like this is a book that literally you've been writing for your whole life.
That's a very astute point, because most people think, oh, why did you leave studying culture? Why are you not, studying the expressive cultural components? And, I am actually still working in that area, but I just felt like, beneath all the work is really about how Black people, when you examine when they're at the center of the story, what can we see about the world that they're in, that we've created? How can we even appreciate what they've done if you don't know what they're up against? And how can you critique what you wish they could do or do better if you don't know all the ways in which they're being, mistreated, et cetera, discriminated against, and just suffering? So for me, that's always been at the heart of my interest. And then, of course, what are the creative strategies, right? How have we been creative in figuring ways out? So that is beneath really all of my work, which is why I hold expressive culture to what I think most people would say is a high standard, because it's not just about entertainment. It's like we survive or die based on whether or not we preserve the right seeds in our repertoire, right? I mean, it's literally that. And will there be enough of us who are still sane enough, who haven't been destroyed enough from all kinds of things, from toxic food to police to, you name it, Are there going to be enough of us to hold on? I mean, I think those are the kind of questions we need to be asking, not, did you see the halftime show? I mean, it's not that we shouldn't ask that a little bit, but we're just so focused there. We don't have any critical, media to discuss Black life in the fundamental sense. I mean, that's why I think what you're doing is so important. But yeah, it is both really a move away from certain kinds of conversations, but it's a move away that is, in a weird sense, a kind of boomerang back to the base of my concern, right? I mean, I love hip hop for its artistry,
Right.
historically, especially. But I also saw it as it's an amazing example of like what Black folk do with so little, and the power of, even if it's not a conscious vision of a way of approaching things that is passed down. We've passed that down generation after generation, even though we don't even know necessarily when we're kids what the heck we're involved in. But that practice of that set of traditions of making something out of nothing, of seeing a communal when they want you to think you're the end of the world, of sharing very little, because when you share what little bit you have, you get more back, and it helps everybody. All of those things, figuring out how to critique fools when they're right in front of your face and they don't even know they're the subject of the goddamn conversation. I mean, you know what I mean? It's like, I mean, it's happened to me. I was like, man, was that about me? I was like, I think that whole thing was, I was like, that was not as complimentary as I would have liked. Do you know what I mean, though? It's like,
I get
there's
it.
just so much there. But you're really right. It's not a departure. The systems thinking is more explicit now for me, much more explicit. That's true.
Let me ask you this, like, and I could ask how long you've been working on this book, but I'm really interested in finding out what was the moment when you decided that you really needed to do this work? What was it? The
Yeah.
late stage disappointment in Obama? Was it everything that unraveled with Trump
Yeah.
won?
No.
Was it all this conversation, about a reckoning that occurred,
Mm. Yeah, that right.
in
No, no, it's way
2020?
before. It's way
Yeah,
before that, Mark. Yeah,
yeah.
that's a great question. See, I need to be on the show with you every day. I'm already super amped. My brain is all happy. There's all kind of James Brown moves going on in my head. So listen, this happened actually several years before all that. Obama was president, but it was his second. It was near the. It was the second term,
Hmm.
and I started teaching my typical classes on on hip hop, on Black urban life, on Black feminism, and a few other things. And then I started noticing that most people did not understand what affirmative action was. They didn't understand that there were policies in place to attempt to create a level playing field.
Hmm.
An increasing number of incredibly well-educated people of all racial backgrounds in all regions of the country, and international students from around the world had no idea that Black
Hmm.
people were still experiencing the vast majority of the
Hmm.
things they were experiencing before civil rights movement victories in terms of voting rights, Civil Rights Act, desegregation in housing and education and all that period, that end of the 1960s.
Hmm.
They just thought that's when we had won, and that, why are you talking about inequality now? They didn't think that 10 years, 15 years earlier. They knew we were still struggling then.
Right.
So
Right.
something happened in about a 15-year period
Yeah.
where the collective knowledge and the collective understanding that there were tremendous victories, none of us would be here, without those victories. But at the same time, there's no question that we were pushed back, and the fight was there from the beginning. Carol
Hmm.
Anderson's amazing book,
Hmm.
White Rage, is
Hmm.
about that. And George Lipsitz, and I mean, there's so many people who've worked on that period and those concerns. But the students, they had no idea. So I started thinking, like, okay, how am I going to explain to them what's structural? Because at that point, I was still using the more loosely defined term of structure, that it's not about personal belief. You could be as Black loving, as brown loving as you want to be, right? You can marry 10 people
Right.
of color
Right.
outside your race and, give them all your lives and all the thing you have that's valuable to you. And that won't change a darn thing about what's really happening. Not a thing. Because the institutions in the world, the system is set up so that you, as the white person, or you, as the male white person in particular, are going to get all the assets that you don't necessarily deserve, all of the advantages, not
Right.
privileges, but advantages. Doesn't matter if your kids are Black.
Right.
you can
Right.
you can't pass it down in the same way, but it's not going to stop you from getting them, right? Because it's not your love of Black people that changes racism in this way. So
Right.
I realized, oh my gosh, I got to teach this. I got to teach this somehow. So I started a course called How Structural Racism Works. Huge number of kids signed up. And so we went through color blindness. We went to individual, interpersonal. And then I tried to explain, look, if you take these 5 major institutions, and then I cut one out, and then things evolve, Mark. So it was housing, education, criminal justice, housing, education, criminal justice, the media, and wealth. Right, because wealth as an institution is you can't make sense of economic discrimination just by looking at job rates
Right,
and
right,
jobless rates,
right.
right? So we spent like a few weeks on each one, and then I said, okay, so let's look at how these things interconnect. So at that point, I realized, okay, people don't understand that you have to have a paradigm shift. You have to look for discrimination differently. You have to look at discrimination differently, and you have to contextualize it in ways that are far richer and deeper than had previously been done.
Yeah,
Everyone says it's structural, or it's not an individual thing, but the depths of what's happening has not been really done. So that started the course,
yeah.
which then led me to, hey, you know what? I was trying to be like you, bro. Maybe just do a couple videos. I'll explain the thing. You know what I mean? So then I was like, oh, wait a minute, this is way more complicated than I thought. So I hired a bunch of students, and we spent years looking at hundreds of policies in those areas. I took the media out and substituted health,
hmm
um, for a lot of reasons. Media runs through all those things. It's not
hmm
its own
hmm
driver by itself in the same way. And we found, what I realized is the most extraordinary um, um, transformation of how systems of racial discrimination have become effective in new ways since the 70s and 80s. So what has happened that I think is so important but very hard to convey quickly in sound bites is that it used to be, as a law would just say, Negroes not allowed, or don't rent to these fools because you're gonna get thrown out too. Or I mean, they were just all out with it, right? Even in the North, where they claimed they weren't racist, they had all kinds of covenants
Right,
and
right.
so on and so forth. And one thing led to, no, we're not going to lend you any money because we know you got bad credit. You're black, and they would just sell you things, right? They went from that in the North and the South in different ways to a process by which they adopted colorblind language,
hmm
but included in the policies were 2 kinds of things. One, additional features
hmm
that hooked into other kinds of discrimination in other aspects of society,
hmm
right? Creating that compound effect that systems thinking reveals. And they've basically deployed the impact of that policy strategically. So stand your ground. If
hmm
everybody could stand their ground, white folk would be dying for it, and black folk would be getting off. That don't happen. Black
Not
folk
at
never
all.
get off. They can't stand no
Right,
ground. Someone could be in your bedroom 3 o'clock in the morning. You shoot them, and they're white and you're black. There's gonna be a question about whether or not it was
right.
legit. Didn't you see him raise his hands up? Didn't you see he was an unwell person and he didn't mean it? So you look at the stats and the kinds of applications that, when it's invoked, how it's invoked, what's allowed, the mechanisms of the outcome of
Yeah,
that
yeah,
policy are
yeah.
not colorblind. The second thing that happens is you add components that mean nothing, like, oh, you're being freed from prison after 15 years, even though you shouldn't have been in there for more than 2 weeks. Okay, well, you know what? You're still a bad person to us, so we're not gonna. You can't pay this price. We've decided there's no payment except there's enough. So you
Right,
can't go stay in any other public institutions,
right,
any benefits. You can't get welfare. You can't visit your mom in public housing. You can't get a state license to be a barber. You
right,
can't. So what they do is create things that have nothing to do
right.
with with your actual punishment originally, but they create after effects for formerly incarcerated people that are designed to hook in to other forms of discrimination. So it creates this undertow of interactivity between all of these areas that you would normally not think. You look at stand your ground, you think, well, there's nothing about race in here. Or you look at misdemeanor fines and fees.
Mm,
Many people have researched and shown that the disparity in attacks as well as punishment levels from minor fines and fees have crushed black poor people around the
Right,
country with
right,
no black cops,
right,
small towns. It's not.
right.
So that's the system that is really, it's like the toxic air that's making us all just being unable to breathe, right? That can't breathe isn't just about the original cop choking. It's about the entire toxic
System. Yeah,
system
yeah.
and the economic pressure, so many ways in which this intersection works. So that's why I moved to systems thinking, because that makes you focus on those intersections. whereas
So let me ask,
structure doesn't do that. Does that make sense?
that makes absolute sense. Now for the audience who doesn't quite get what meta-racism is,
Right.
and twofold question, right? One, describe what meta-racism is,
Sure.
and also narrate what the discussion might have been with your publisher, your editor, about calling the book meta-racism
Yeah.
in a book that superficially reads as kind of an extension of the anti-racist scholarship
Yeah.
that has been popularized in the
I
last
know.
4 or 5 years. I mean, what was that
But it's really
conversation
not
like?
that at all. It's really
Exactly.
the opposite.
Exactly.
I know.
Absolutely.
I
Absolutely.
know. I know. So let me first do some defining, and then
Hmm.
I'll. That's certainly an interesting trajectory to go back to. So in systems thinking asks us to look at all of the key relationships inside of
Hmm.
a system, and for something to be called a system, it has to have four major characteristics. It has parts and elements that you can identify. So a
Hmm.
box of sand is not a system because they're not parts that are separate from one another that can interact. Okay,
Right.
so just because something's together or laying on top of each other doesn't make it a system. So you have to have parts you can identify. Are those parts interconnected? In other words, do they relate to each other and because of those interactions change what's happening? Right? Thus, again, inert sand doesn't work.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, are those effects of those interactions um, having creating additional compound impact over in general? So it's not just that they interact, but the interaction causes what you would call meta effects, uber effects, right? That's another word, right, that systems thinkers use to say that the connections between these part A and part B produces effects that cannot be produced by just A alone.
Right.
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 So if you have A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, and pulling out one is not what the problem is. It's how all of these
Work
things are
together.
interacting
Right.
together, create effects that are much greater than any single part or any single interaction. It's not one plus one equals two. It's the nonlinear, multidimensional, layered interaction that makes
Hmm.
systems so powerful or destructive, right? They can go either way, happily powerful or destructive. The final thing is over time. The final thing is over time, right? That means this is not a 5-day project, right? For a system to really reveal its outcomes, you need time. And it's in that time that the compound elements occur, that the sense of the constant arrangement of accumulation takes
Hmm.
place.
Hmm.
And that's what makes systems so powerful. Now, a structure is inert in its description. A structure is built certain ways. It doesn't have that level of flexibility. Systems adapt and change over time. Why? Because they're created for an outcome, right? They may say they're for something. So let's take the hospital system because everybody knows we got a medical system, a health system. I take the word care out because that's a question. But they say they're a healthcare system, right? So what are the outcomes, right? The outcomes are like, well, they're shaky, especially in certain areas. They're like, well, ain't no care going on here and
No.
very little
No.
health,
No. No.
right? It's basically maintaining chronic illnesses for profit, creating chronic illnesses and maintaining them for profit. But that's not all they do. But they do just enough health care that we can't completely see
Hey.
this is
Right.
going on.
Right.
So we call it a healthcare system. But the outcomes are not healthcare. So
Right.
whenever you're doing a systems analysis, you don't really care what the person calls it. You want to know what the outcomes are. And the outcomes are driven by the system's relationships, the pieces and how they relate. So when the insurance companies get involved and they're allowed to do X to the doctors and the doctors are vulnerable to Y and the nurses and the cost of education and the lack of training on certain issues, and you put it all together, you're like, well, yeah, this is the outcome. I mean, it's an obvious outcome when you really
Right.
look
Right.
systemically, right?
Right.
So
Right.
that's why it's not a structure because structures can't adapt like that. They're not as flexible as a systems framework. So now if you say, well, how do I fix the system of healthcare problems? You have to figure out what are the biggest leverage points? What are the places that have the biggest impact on maintaining the system the way it is and adapting in ways that support the same outcome? That kind of what I call, monstrous adaptation, right? Where they just find a way to get the same
Hmm.
outcome, usually profit, right? Usually lack of risk, reduction of
Hmm.
risk, and increase in profit.
Hmm.
And so when you take those, you obviously got to start with, the insurance industry. Luigi
Hmm.
wasn't wrong. Luigi maybe gone about it the wrong
The
way
wrong
because we
way.
sure
Right, right,
disappeared. That
right.
brother disappeared. He was news. I haven't seen him in weeks. I mean, they erased him, right? Because he was having he started a
The
conversation.
conversation that nobody wanted to
Right.
have.
You
Yep,
can't even get
yep.
to the system. You can't even talk about it, right? So that leads me to uh, why my book has really nothing to do with what I call the anti-racism industry, because I'm not in the business of asking people, black, white, brown, yellow, green, purple, red, to sit around and wonder about their own internal personal racism.
Right,
Okay,
right.
we've done been down that road. And you know what? We're all jacked in this. Layers of degree. Many of us feel the brunt more than the benefit of a systemic racist system. But either way, we're all in this soup. Okay. So we got to figure out how we're going to do the best we can do as collectively as possible and in ways that keeps everybody at whatever table they can contribute in. And the paradigm shift, if they're willing to make a paradigm shift, right? That which I don't think people, like that subset of groups, I don't really have any hostility toward them. I don't have any hostility toward Kendi or toward Robin DiAngelo, but they're not interested in the thing I'm interested in.
Right, right.
I'm
It's
interested
different
in
work.
saying, look,
Yep.
I want us to change the way this system works. I'm not interested in hurt feelings or not hurt feelings. I'm interested in people taking grown up responsibility and contributing where they can. But they have to make the paradigm shift that this is not a personal behavioral issue, that this is not about, paying back for slavery per se. It's understanding that legacies matter only because we've allowed the system to exist. Legacy, if we had changed everything at 1865, if we had just totally broken that system, we would not be here.
Yeah, yeah.
It's not slavery, it's also after slavery and
Right.
Jim Crow and after Jim Crow, right? And what the attacks on the civil rights movement and the anti-affirmative action and where we are right now is all an extension of an adapting system, a monstrous adapting system. You see, and so you can be as anti-racist as you want. You cannot change systemic advantages by being pleasant to individual black
Yeah.
people. And that just upsets people because they just want to be nice and then figure out that the bad guy is some cop in
It's some back
Minneapolis.
as a cop. Yep. Right.
And
Right.
yes, we need to stop those cops. And yes, we need to do better. And yes, we've internalized stuff that black folk need to purge themselves of, right? We're all in this soup. But that's not what's on our neck as much as the rest. If we get the rest together, the massive institutional destruction of our communities, we'll be in a better position to start interrogating our unconscious bias.
Robin D.G. Kelly describes you as a public intellectual in his great words about Metaracism, the book. And you came up in a generation of time where there was a flourishing of, black public intellectuals, particularly folks, right? Because there always been black public intellectuals, but folks
Oh,
who
for
were
sure.
aligned with the academy, right?
Right.
That it was kind of a brand new moment.
Right.
And I always felt that, for folks who were out there was a responsibility. Like I was always conscious when Cornell stopped using terms like Cornell West, socialism and Marxism to describe his work, because there's some words you just can't let out in the wild.
Right.
Right? I mean, that's just right. The population in general is not equipped to understand the full dynamics of it. And then people get a hold of language and just do things with it. And so I think about that in this particular moment, the way terms like, because we know we have younger students and colleagues and social media gave them an access to the public that was unimaginable to many of us 30 years ago, right?
Exactly.
So they all went to graduate school preparing to be these public figures, on Twitter, Facebook, whatever. And the words in theory started to flow. So Afro-pessimism and woke and intersectionality, and specifically I'm thinking about DEI now. And so this language gets pushed out there, right? And gets connected to a bunch of folks, none of which who have a real capacity to understand what it is intellectually, let alone describe it, right? I'm always struck by the right not actually being able to give you a definition of particularly a term like intersectionality or critical race theory.
No,
right?
they're not even trying anymore. They're not even trying to understand it. Yeah.
And so we get to this DEI moment. How are you unpacking DEI? And it was a question before January 20th.
Oh,
right?
long before that. Yeah.
And of
Yeah.
course,
Yeah.
has just recently got absolutely absurd,
Yeah.
right? How do we push back against the way the language is being framed in terms about
Mm-hmm.
Black possibility and capabilities,
Mm-hmm. Right.
right? And even now, disabled folks,
Yeah.
and their abilities in the context of this
Yeah.
conversation?
Yeah. Well, that's a really, really great question. So let me just start by saying that the emptying out of language designed to create a just and relatively even playing field, or at least the aspiration of creating such an environment, is not new, right? I mean,
Right.
since again, I'm not a scholar of every century, but certainly in the 20th and 21st century, starting mostly in the 60s, I think that many right wing people began, and conservatives in general, began to realize that they had to reassert they had to
Mm-hmm.
take back over words like freedom.
Right.
When the civil rights movement was able, and the women's rights movement, right, and the anti-war movement, were able to create a generational zeitgeist and a kind of paradigm that militarism, right, and capitalism and racism, that these things were intertwined, and that freedom from them was at the heart of a certain kind of future that wasn't exploiting and imperialist in many ways. And so, and also just brutally capitalist, not like, hey, let me make some money on what I gave you because I need to keep money for the business. That's not even, we should rename that. That's not even capitalism. Like mom and
Right.
pop stores should be some other thing.
Right.
We're talking
Right.
about voracious companies,
Right.
tobacco companies buying up food companies. Like, why is Philip Morris buying Kraft in the
Right.
70s, right? Like,
Right.
what's going on? Anyway, that whole system was driven by words that held people together, right? Freedom and justice and love, and we shall overcome, the kind of ethics of care that drove Black church
Mm-hmm.
interpretations of Christianity. That was like the target. Freedom became a libertarian term, right? And justice and equality are now being used against us. Affirmative action was supposed to be a positive thing,
Right.
and then it became diversity because it became a racist term. Then
Right.
we went from diversity to diversity and inclusion, and then we have diversity, inclusion, and equity, and then we
Equity.
got, oh, I mean, we got more letters on the back of that,
Right.
and it's
Right.
all about a retreat from an advancing critique, a la earlier generations of Christopher Rufo, right, who's doing that
Right.
today.
Right.
But he's not the first, right? This has been happening long before, to figure out how to control the language to bring it back. What is patriotism? White nationalism. We're
Right.
moving,
Right.
they're moving closer and closer together, so that you and I cannot be patriotic, even though we are often desperately wanting this to be a democratic, peace, safe transition of power nation that interrogates, that truly appreciates the rule of law and applies it fairly and evenly to everybody. We would be thrilled with that, right? We're all for that. They want something else, and so they've taken the language. So I wanted to historicize that because we forget that they've always been taking the language and
Right.
trying to
Right.
make us run from it. So then the question is, what do we do? Do we keep saying anti? Do we say woke when their anti woke has so much more traction? Do we come up with something else? And that's a tough call. I think what we really want to focus on is what those words are symbolizing. Keep
Right.
going back to the definition of why
Right.
we think those words matter. Why I say meta racism. I'm not making a claim that it's bigger and badder than any other racism on earth. I'm saying meta, if in the context of systems, means you have to examine a multi-century
Right.
process by
Right.
which the effects of a system have been not just allowed to compound and devastate, but in fact encouraged. And efforts to change it have slowed it down, but efforts to close those other counter efforts have brought us back to where we are. Mass incarceration was a brilliant way, through the process of minor drug trafficking, right, drug trading, to completely destroy Black urban communities. I mean, because they had no jobs and they didn't want a revolution, right?
Right.
So they said, what are we going to do with all these unemployed people we don't want to employ and don't want to pay for and don't want to give them public housing and we don't want them to have welfare? We're going to put them in jail. Well, what's going to be our reasoning? Oh, they're criminals. Oh, yeah, that's the 14th Amendment. I mean, the 13th Amendment, we did that already. Oh, okay, let's just extend it.
Right.
Make them all criminals and they can go to jail. So That's what I want people to remember. Like, what anti-woke means is they're anti-awareness about Black life and our
Right.
centrality to the nation.
Right.
So just stay on that. Black people at the center of the nation. This is a fact. Just, and if you say, well, look, if that's what being woke means, well, I mean, you could say you're anti discussing full history. Okay. Just let me know. What are you for? You're only for history from one perspective? I thought you were about freedom of speech and analysis and discussion and intelligence. And in fact, aren't you worried that diversity is reducing excellence? So why wouldn't you want to challenge me to a discussion about it? I mean, you're not afraid of me. I mean, I got to be stupid. Right? I mean, like, why are we getting caught up in the words? Like, no, we just need to we need to talk ideas. They have stopped talking
Of
ideas
ideas. Right.
because they cannot win on ideas. They want people to feel the emotional attachment to be against a kind of um, uh, a nebulous feeling
Mm-hmm.
of hostility toward this other
Mm-hmm.
thing called immigrants, called non-white immigrants, from Black people, from queer people, from poor people in general, whoever it is that they haven't been able to sink their teeth into. So I think we shouldn't. I think we get caught up in the DEI. This is just a mechanism to
Right.
stop.
Right.
The any program that has been in a little bit successful in leveling temporarily or increasing the upside of a playing field that's been highly unequal is going to be slayed,
Yeah.
right? And that it doesn't matter what word you come up with, you have to anticipate is going to belong to them at some point.
Mm-hmm.
That
And
makes, I
learn how
mean,
to
what
pivot.
do you
Right. Learn how to pivot.
what do you think? I mean, what do you think we ought to be doing, Mark? I mean, what's been your concern in this moment?
I think we always have to be more careful about the language, right? I always go
Right.
back to that hip hop adage, and it might have been KRS One, but real bad people move in silence,
That's right.
right? Just because you have a platform to share everything doesn't mean you need to be sharing everything, right?
You are right about that.
And
That's
understand that
true.
there are discrete audiences, and in many ways, we're in a moment that because corporate media is so pervasive,
Hmm.
and we all love the idea of the Piece in the Times or the Washington Post or the New Republic or being on NPR. We have let our independent Black media institutions become diminished, right? Because we don't see them as a viable location for us to talk to people, and most importantly, to talk to Black people.
I mean, it's appalling what's happened. I mean, what you're pointing out. I know this is the people who might potentially watch this. I'm about to have like one of those like little inside conversations, like Margaret. But like this will come up next week in at the event that we're going to be at
Doing
together.
right,
Because we have allowed the kind of um, corporate's not even a big enough word for what I
yeah,
want to say
right,
here, but for the
right,
moment, I'll just use it. We've allowed the corporate takeover of our public space.
yeah,
We have
hmm
bought in so heavily into the
hmm
myth of some kind of integration that we can participate in that system and not
right.
lose something significant.
Like a marketplace of ideas, right?
We lose all of the subjectivity that we brought to
Right,
our own
right,
spaces. We lose all of the space to go all the way from people who are horrible on some things and amazing on others to another range of people who are horrible on some things and amazing on others, right? You go in that mainstream world, you have to bring it, like you said, down into, you can't say Marx, you can't say this, you can't say that, you can't say radical feminist, you can't say, and then you end up talking like you're on CNN, when you're
right,
done full time. And
right,
it looks like you're talking about something. Remember what I said in the beginning of our conversation? Our stories make it impossible to see the systems, right? When I said,
right,
you asked me
right,
why I got into this, and then we think those are our stories. What we know about Trayvon, about Mike Brown, about George Floyd, about the institutional and systemic uh, beatdown that everyone in those community faces, and they become emblems of that, stand-ins, right? That is what I want people to start thinking. Not like, oh, it's too bad what happened to him, but that he is us,
right.
right? It's like it's an individual act meant to terrorize the community. In that sense, it's a little bit like lynching, and I hate using that
Yeah,
word
yeah,
casually.
I
So
get it.
just let me slow down with that. But you know what I mean. But it's a little bit like you do one, and the benefit for these monstrous people is not just this one, but the fear that it'll be you. So
Right,
everybody has to see, right?
right.
And that is what has happened in turn. We don't even understand what a Black intellectual space, for the most part, or even a Black musical
Right,
cultural space,
right, right.
right? I mean, you can't critique the market. Artists can't critique their own oppression. 12 cents
Right.
for a stream,
Or, or,
15
or,
cents.
or sue them if you're Drake.
I mean, God forbid. I mean, you're done. I mean, Prince was the last one to say anything. He was in his own world anyway, so he didn't
Right.
mind, right? But Lupe made some efforts at certain points to make some critiques, and the whole Spin and all these other magazines. Everybody came to the defense of the big business, and
Yeah.
you don't stand a chance unless you stay all the way out
Yeah.
and don't have any relationships that are then to be risked. But once you're in and you're chosen, it's a real thing. It's a real thing. So I don't know, how do we get that back? We have all this technology and we got we have very little space that we value.
Yeah.
You know what I
I,
mean? Like so that's a whole different thing than from when you and I started in
absolutely.
this field.
I mean, I'd like to think, we're both by choice in Black Studies departments right
Mhm.
now, right? And I
Right.
mentioned the by choice piece because
Mhm.
we're also at stages in our career where we easily could have made other choices in terms of where
Correct.
we wanted our institutional homes
Right.
to be. Do you have any concerns for the work that Black Studies writ large
Whew.
is doing these
Mm.
days, right? And I don't want to get too much because we
Yeah.
all have stories about
Yeah.
what it's like to interact with undergraduate students these days that on many levels are shocking and disappointed, but not their
Right.
fault because they are a
Right.
product of this particular
I
moment.
mean, they're like your own, they're like your own chickens coming home to
Kids,
roost.
right?
You're
Your own
like,
kids, yeah, right.
I feel like Malcolm. I'm like, well, he had a point. I don't know if he meant these chickens, but we got a whole new breed coming. Yeah, I hear you. Yeah, I think Black Studies has been vulnerable to intellectual versions of the problem we're talking about,
Yeah,
and that is that. Um, I was just reading a piece that Imani Perry wrote a while ago about Lorraine Hansberry and that famous scene in Robert Kennedy's office when the
yeah.
question of like what to do and the fear of the riots and everything becoming a problem. And Baldwin writes about this a million times, but in the
Mm-hmm.
scene, um, Kennedy thinks he should be talking to the black people he thought were leaders, right? So
Mm-hmm.
when this young gentleman from the town they're in, I can't remember what the issue was specifically right now, but his name is Jimmy, and he starts talking about his personal experience with the circumstances, and he's speaking as a regular working class brother. Kennedy turns to the anointeds and says, "Well, why am I talking to him? Who is he?"
Yeah,
And Lorraine busted up talking about that is exactly who you need to be
you need to be
talking to.
talking to, right,
So,
right.
and so then, he got offended. And so anyway, it rolled on. But why do I tell that moderately long story? Because that is the thing that Black Studies was supposed to institutionalize. That moment Lorraine says
Mm-hmm.
he's
Mm-hmm.
exactly who should be talked to. That doesn't mean you take everything he says as gospel. It does not
Right,
mean he knows things that you don't know that are more important or less important. It doesn't mean all that. It means that this project is not going to be saved by high theory.
right, right.
The black people are not going to get any value add around what they can do to save their lives, their children, their grandchildren, their ancestral memory, knowledge of the oppression that's facing them. It's not going to help anybody do anything.
Yeah,
That is a betrayal in whatever theories that are that
right,
go
right,
that far away from
right.
humanity,
Yep,
that far
yep.
away from lived current suffering, historical ingeniousness, and elevates the idea of the beauty of black sounding ideas by themselves, and that
Mm-hmm.
somehow that the best way out is to give up, that a kind of relinquishing of possibility is
Mm-hmm.
the conclusion, is a project that I think is fundamentally, even though it may not in any way intended, I think it's an anti-black message.
And in this way that
It doesn't make me popular, I will say,
I mean
but
the
that's my
argument that
feeling.
the argument that you just make. I mean, it is the privilege of being at elite institutions to be able to think that way, right?
I mean, it's such a
No,
privilege;
no,
it's
no
beyond me.
one working on the ground trying to feed their family and clothe folks are thinking of that they're just so caught up in this abjectness,
Exactly. In
right?
fact,
That
that
they
is
can't go forward, right? It's
exactly. Not only that, but it totally eviscerates what has made Black culture so amazing. It's
Right.
basically
Right.
saying that,
Right.
they're just so down they can't do anything. Well, you know what? They're doing a whole lot more with their suffering than you do and are with your privilege and your
And
advantages,
resources. Right.
right? And
Yeah.
your own suffering, right? Because,
Right.
I mean, nobody who has to actually survive something on a day-to-day basis that is horrible, in wartime and so-called peacetime, is going to tell you that there's, until they've completely given up, they're not going to tell you there's nothing they can do, because it's about what you do around what you do. You see,
Right.
that's the genius to me of Black culture. They're like, look, I see
Yeah.
they got all this shit blocked off, so I know not to get invested. I see that. I
Right.
see the okey doke, right? I'm not going to look.
Right.
But
Right.
I'm gonna dress the way I want to dress. I'm gonna change the way people play basketball. I'm gonna completely destroy the standard English language
I'm gonna name my
until
kids what I
until
name my
I
kids.
want. I know.
Right.
I marvel at that. I'm like, how about Joanna? Nope. Becky? Nope. And they have all the whole same baby books anybody else could look at, right? I mean, who would think Shaquille O'Neal would become a name that would just roll off your
Roll
tongue?
off
Remember
somebody's
when you
rice.
first?
Right. Right.
I mean,
Right.
Shaq is a nice shorthand, but Shaquille was a hard word to say, 45, 50 years ago. My point is that it's not only the outs more symbols, it's the cultures of self affirmation, of community affirmation. As I was saying before, how do you go from this individual, avoid this individualization, to seeing yourself as part of a community? Of course, I'm being romantic. Of course,
Right.
nothing's perfect. Of course,
Right.
we are also broken because we've been broken by people and we've tried to heal ourselves, but that doesn't mean we didn't get broken.
Right.
And that happens too. But that's what's happening. That is
Mm-hmm.
the struggle. That is the beauty, the joy, the terrible. To people who do that and move to the ground, I respect enormously, right? Which is not that many. But people who live entirely in this level of abstraction and convince a generation of people who have not necessarily read much about the history,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because who needs it? We just know
Mm-hmm.
Black is done. So we're going to have ever complex ways of saying it's impossible. But we've not even taught people really what it is on the ground.
Yeah.
I mean, I've had students say to me, I have no agency, zero, as a Black woman. I'm like, well, how'd you get here today?
Right.
Like, you have no agency. You're trying to tell me the white man forced you into my Black feminism class today? Is that what you're really trying to tell me? Like, what does that mean? That level of extreme, I'm completely contained. Meanwhile, you're
Right.
fed, you're
Right.
housed, right? You're
Right.
in an Ivy League institution. Now, I
You
say
know
that
how to
not.
say no.
You know how to say no, and you certainly have missed class another time, so that means you have agency in one way or another. I mean, I know I'm being reductive, right? Because it's meant
Yeah.
to be more, agency is a much bigger word than that. But there is a sense in which that is just unaccounted for, the quotidian, the
Yeah.
power to make choices, to have courage, to help people, to reach out. All of these are what build human communities. Of course, there are cultures of oppression that are destroying us. That's why we need to work on creating either people who
Yeah.
can see different paradigms, help people give tools to fight on the ground, but also address the big picture as much as possible. But if you can't give somebody some way to either an artistic outgrowth that really helps them, or some tool, or some comedy, or some political vision, then to me, you wasting people's time.
Yeah.
And you're not. That's just my feeling. I don't. I think it's taking advantage of what our grandparents and our great grandparents did when they said, look, we need access to the best training in the world because we have people in need. And to me, that gift, that gift they gave us with their sacrifice, is not being honored properly.
Yeah. I'd
I
be
mean, yeah.
remiss not to have to talk about hip hop at this point in time. Most
Okay.
importantly, because we are experiencing, you are experiencing the 30th anniversary of Black Noise. We're post 50th anniversary of hip hop, at least as a date,
Hmm.
that
Right.
was
We're still
used to
celebrating and discussing.
identify something. Um, and I'm not even going to ask you about how you feel about hip hop at this point in time because it's well beyond that.
Yeah.
But what do you think hip hop is doing or not doing for us
Yeah.
broadly as a Black community in this moment?
Yeah. Right. Well, I'll begin with my what I'd call my defenses of their situation, right? Like back when we were thinking about hip hop as a something to think about, right? Because it didn't really exist as something
Right.
to think about when I was in graduate school. But we were thinking about it in ways that had everything to do with trying to figure out how it was, what made it come into existence, and why was it have so much influence on young people, and it was so complicated in terms of the messages, right? They were multiple and diverse and complicated, and they were just such a breath of fresh air in many ways. I mean, my husband and I, Andre Willis, were just listening to Public Enemy, like 2 or 3 records straight in this long car trip, and I was like, oh my god, I forgot the incredible
So
intensity of their
much of
sonic
it. Yeah.
interruption.
Yeah.
They dropped the
Yeah.
gauntlet, dude. I
Yeah.
mean, I was having the feeling all over again. It's like it was 1989. 1989. I was like, oh my God. I was like, I got chills in the car. I was like, oh my God, I forgot. Why did I forget? Because they're never on the goddamn radio.
Right.
They're never on Sirius. They're
Right.
never on. You
Right.
can't. There's no intellectual framework. There's no critical, musical analysis space. That's the piece when I said they've been music has been victimized the same way
Right. Right.
as journalism, and that whole space has been destroyed. It is not random. So I thought, oh my God, look what Public Enemy could do, and that's not counting content.
hmm
I'm not even talking political
That's just the
content.
sonic quality of it.
Oh
Yep.
my gosh, it was a hey, this is a new world. That's why I know why folks were fearful. I was like, oh, I see why y'all was tripping now. But I'm saying this only to say that there's hip hop continues to do amazing things. I think Kendrick Lamar is pretty remarkable in a lot of ways. I mean, there's a lot of good talent, and there are people doing amazing and creative things. There's No Name in Chicago. There are
Yeah.
people
Right.
doing Chance in Chicago. There's a lot of people trying to do interesting things and succeeding. But they are not running the direction of hip hop. They are not
Right.
tastemakers. They are not
Right.
trajectory determiners. They're not leaders on a path. Where we are, I think, in the most dangerous sense, is that we have turned away from almost 100% of any critical engagement of the suffering of our communities as a legitimate,
Yeah.
significant piece of the music.
Yeah.
Right? It's just so marginal. That's number one. Number two is that there are almost no grounds for um, a Black feminist challenge that would not, in fact, have to be in the form of sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
That the entire scope of a challenge to power inside of hip hop has been limited to an adaptation to the vision of what Black women
Right.
are, and then a
Right.
minor critique within that space.
Right. Right.
And so there's no space. There's really no space for how this is a there's no vision in it for like what you would want to recreate that comes out of it. And I say that because there are other genres of Black music that young people are making that tell me many other things
Yeah.
that are. So it's not just age. It's in the same generation, right? There are popular songs, popular people asking different questions. Everybody's involved in hip hop to some degree because you can't get out your room
Yeah.
without hip hop.
Yeah.
But I think we got to ask ourselves those questions rather than fighting about hip hop. It's like, well, does hip hop give you like the 10-point plan for your future? Who in hip hop is giving you the 10-point plan for your future? Who's giving you a sense of how to think about love in a period of so much hate? Right? Who's
Yeah.
doing that in this genre?
I,
And you might come up with a few, but then they're gonna be.
I mean, as much as we love Kendrick, I mean, what Kendrick basically gave us was the blueprint for the takedown. I mean,
That's true. Oh, that's a really good point. Say
I
a little
mean,
more about that for a minute. Tell me
I
what you
mean,
mean.
I mean, he really gave us a blueprint for if you don't like somebody and you want to take them down, this is a strategy to do it.
Yeah, that is a
You know,
problem. You mean the recent
the recent
battle?
stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, well,
Yeah. The
that I
recent
was
with
thinking more
Drake.
on the
Yeah.
arc of, the
Right.
last 10 years. But you're right. Well, that's the other thing. It's like instead of saying, I'm not going to get into this battle and here's why, right? But
Right.
you can't even make a political critique. There's no political critique allowed,
Critique
even
at
in the
all. Right.
description of your content, not your content,
Absolutely.
but the description of your intent.
You know, it's funny if someone had told us 30 years ago that hip hop would be the hegemony.
Oh, I would have said, I
We
would have lost my whole bank
we
account.
would not have imagined that it would look this way. We would have been
No.
thinking something totally different in that
That is
context.
so true. I will say, Andre Willis, I'll give it to him here on the air. My husband, we've done thought about hip hop for a long time. He saw it. He saw it. I just
Yeah.
thought we had more reserves. I
Yeah.
thought I just didn't think that. I just didn't see the way it was getting at the fundamental kind of infrastructure. That there was so much eroding going on
Yeah.
that we just couldn't afford that as much as I thought we could afford. Do you
Yeah.
know what I mean? I wanted to give
Yeah.
that sense of freedom. And of course, you know, Public Enemy, Native Tongues. I mean, Tribe Called Quest, and it's not just old timers. There are people that follow them.
Right.
Andre 3000. There's a lot of people who've done
Talib, Most
amazing.
Def. Yeah. Right.
Exactly, done amazing stuff. I mean, Most Def and Black Star, and I mean, there's a lot of amazing people along the way. But I think you really have to be honest that the genre is, if you had to think about it holistically, does more harm than good. I
Yeah.
honestly think that's where we
Yeah.
are. And that's because the saturation of the market with the normalization of the worst impulses of living
Right.
in this
Right.
moment, high
Right.
consumption, disrespect of women,
Mm-hmm.
implications of violence as a result of
Mm-hmm.
responsibility, the
Mm-hmm.
acceptance of a kind of masculinity that is untenable except anywhere but on your way to prison,
Mm-hmm.
the disrespect for staying in community and caring for others, all of that toxic nonsense that we're now seeing in the White House. Hip hop is too close to that, and we can't afford it.
Absolutely.
We just can't
Absolutely.
afford it.
Absolutely.
And we don't even know, how would we, if someone said, well, just consume, don't listen to the ones you don't like. I'm like, well, okay. The irony is it'd be easier to find an underground MC 25 years ago than now with all these outlets, but they still control where we go. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. Tricia, I don't necessarily want to remind folks how long we've been doing this.
Yeah, well, I think that jig is up.
And I've told you this many times, but do want to say it in this particular public forum. You gave me about 45 minutes at the MLA in 1992 in New York City. I remember it was my first MLA. It was really my first conference. I remember it was a panel with Fred Jameson and Wanima Lubiano.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Well, that's a hell of a panel right there.
Andrew Ross, and it's important because, there's no email, right? There's no social media.
Email.
You can't text them. I can't even imagine. I must have had to have called you.
Yeah, exactly. You didn't call me on the phone because that's all we had was a landline, bro.
Which is
we
like
thought it
so
was cool.
crazy
We had
and
buttons to press.
But you gave me 45 minutes when I was a young graduate student just trying to figure it out. And I've always been so thankful for that because there's still things you told me in that conversation that are applicable to me and my career now.
Wow.
And it's hard really to explain to some of the younger students and scholars. I mean, because they have their own heroes and
right.
folks, but their connections to them were largely mediated through social media.
Right.
I happen to come up in a generation of time where, like, you called people, you wrote letters, you sat down and met them. And the example of yourself, a Robin Kelly, or Cornel West, or Mike Eric Dyson was simply invaluable to me, right? To find my voice and my lane in this work. And I just want to, again, publicly thank you, for that moment and for the example of the work that you have done since then.
I really appreciate that, Mark. And you were hungry and interested and curious, and you were serious as a person. I mean, it doesn't take long. We're not that far apart in age, but it doesn't take long to talk to someone and know if they're playing games, and are they there for some other agenda. You were so serious that I thought, wow. If someone had told me any of this 5, 6, 7 years ago, whatever it was, that would have been fantastic. So my whole thing is like, what would help most in this situation? Yeah. And so I'm just really glad that I can't believe any of it held up all these years. That's a long time ago. But I'm also glad that you have that memory because we have to pass that on. People have a hard time understanding the difference between attention from afar and celebrity and like valuable contribution.
Absolutely.
And sacrifice and what's at risk, because people think, you and Tricia, say Mark and Tricia, and y'all wrote on hip hop and got famous. Like, no, you don't understand. Everybody, we were being ignored. It's the opposite.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
The opposite was, you're so smart, Mark. Why did you write about this?
Why you do this?
You're so smart, Tricia. Why didn't you write about something else? You could be a superstar in our terms, right? They don't understand all the disrespect.
And arguing in institutions about teaching these courses, like, what's anybody going to get out of this class?
Right? Oh my God! I mean, we were at NYU when Harold Bloom was talking about the decline of Western civilization in the curriculum.
Right.
I mean, his office was a block away from mine. He never said a word to me.
let alone what the books were that we were going to use in these courses, right? Because they hadn't been written
Exactly.
yet, right?
That's
Yeah,
right. No, exactly. Exactly. A whole bunch of little articles, right, being strung together. So, no, I really appreciate that. And, I think, it's very difficult to critique what's happening when you want to keep everyone together, and also they don't want to sort of slay their elders, so they
right.
often people hold back, and I
Yeah,
respect that. But on the other hand, I wish we could figure out how to have the real conversation, which is
yeah,
you know it might be that I'm misinterpreting people's intentions, but all I know is the outcome. See, I'm a systems
yeah,
thinker. I look at the outcome, and what I see isn't what I want to see. Because there's nobody. I mean, you can't. Nobody's saying what they need to say.
yeah,
Very few. I shouldn't say no. But Robin is amazing at this. The amazing thing about Robin is that he finds a way to make everybody happy.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Absolutely,
I'm
absolutely.
like, Robin, how could you be kind of mad at everybody and everybody loves you still? What kind of talent is that? Because I'm a little bit less indirect than he is, so I don't really inspire a whole lot of love festivals, except from a certain character type of person. But one last thing I wanted to say about you coming up to me is that there's a tremendous disrespect of Black women in the field.
Hmm.
And I have
Hmm.
students who think they should only talk to the male faculty. You can see it in their whole behavior until about 4 or 5 years in, and they realize, oh, sugar plums.
Hmm.
Any number of women, is a badass, and I
Hmm.
messed up. I know I'm not around. I am not around in round two. So you better take yourself back to that man who's not writing you letters, who's not telling you what really happened, who let you put in some whack work because he really didn't care and make you look
Hmm.
bad for the rest of your
Hmm.
career. I can't help you. You should have thought about that, right? Because you're not in with this in crowd of
Hmm.
obfuscation of reality is what is what I see it as. And so there's a lot, and you didn't come to me with that. So there's only two ways: either come with the I'm gonna be cool because I'm gonna approach this as a social environment, which is inappropriate, or
Hmm.
I'm just not gonna talk to her because I'm gonna go try to get to Cornell. I'm gonna try,
Hmm.
get to
Right,
Dyson.
right.
And that just speaks to you weren't just one of the first brothers to write on feminism from a Black man's perspective in the academy. You were living it long before you wrote
Hmm.
that book.
Thank you,
So
thank you,
just tell, in case anybody's unsure about that, you send them over to me, okay?
thank you, thank you. I appreciate that,
It's
Tricia.
it's hard to do. It's hard to do.
Yeah.
It's hard to do, but you be holding it down.
We've been joined today by Professor Tricia Rose, the Chancellor's Professor of Africana Studies and Associate Dean of the Faculty for Special Initiatives at Brown University. We talked about her marvelous new book, Metaracism, How Systemic Racism Devastates Black Lives and How We Break Free, published by Basic Books, 2024. Thank you for this time, Tricia.
It's my pleasure entirely. We have to get together again soon. I'll tell you of some another amazing things coming on the way soon. So we'll have a part two if you'll allow it.
Yes, I would love that.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me, Mark, and thanks to Eric and the whole team for keeping this thing on in the world, because what we see is not always what it looks like.
Blacks, they be hyping, I'm the light that lit your match. A black watch for all the times I watch MTV raps. Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every